are listening to Stories from Palestine podcast, a bi-weekly podcast recorded in Palestine and about Palestine. My name is Crystal. I studied history and tour guiding, and I live in Palestine with my Palestinian husband and children. I'm originally from the Netherlands. I am a licensed tour guide by the Palestinian Authority, and yes, you can hire me for tours. Follow me on social media and visit my website to learn more about organized tours and programs. You can find the links in the show notes. I hope you will enjoy listening to this episode. Hey guys, welcome to a new episode of Stories from Palestine podcast. It's been a few weeks since I did the last episode on Ascalon, and today's episode is about another city in the coastal area, but much more to the north. Today I'm taking you to Akka, and you will hear the name Akko. You will hear also the name Acre. So what is it and how does it come that we have different names? Well, of course, over time, names change, and it depends on the language that people spoke in the country in certain periods and who were the rulers. So if we talk about the origin of the name, then we can go back all the way to the Canaanite period in the Bronze Age time, when in the Egyptian execration texts, the name Akka appears in hieroglyphic script. So it seems that the root of the name Akko or Akka or Acre already exists since the 19th century before Christ. And then we start reading about Akko. Also in the Bible, it is referred to Akko. And then when the Crusaders come into the picture, much later in the 11th century, they call it Acre. And in Arabic, it is called Akka. Also, it's been called in the Greek Hellenistic period a completely different name, because that's what the Greeks used to do. They used to rename all the cities and give them names that referred to their Greek Hellenistic rulers. So Akka became Ptolemais. So for a period of time, the city had a completely different name. I will call it Akka, the way that it's been called in the last centuries in Arabic. And Akka is on the UNESCO World Heritage List. It is a beautiful city that is situated north of Haifa, and it is basically the only place where there is a natural promontory, which means that there is a kind of bay that could serve as a natural harbor. So Akka always had the function of a harbor receiving boats and ships from over the Mediterranean that were importing, and of course there was also exporting goods from the harbor of Akka. Actually, we should speak about three Akkas. There is the Akka that you would visit when you come as a tourist, which is the old city of Akka within the city walls. There is also the ancient Akka. The first people who lived here in the early and Middle Bronze Age lived a little bit more to the east, a bit away from the sea, close to a river called the Naaman River. And they had, especially in the Middle Bronze Age, a fortified city. The ruins of that city have been found and excavated on what we call a tell. I've talked about tells before, so I'm not going to explain that again, but we have different layers of civilization on a tell, and this tell in Arabic is known as Tel el Fukhar. And Fukhar is the Arabic word for oven, and in oven you will bake pottery. And probably they gave the name to this tell because they found so much pottery shards dating to the Bronze Age time and the period after, that they called it Tel el Fukhar. And then we also have the modern city of Akka, which has grown especially after 1948, after the establishment of the State of Israel. So if you visit Akka, you have these three different Akkas, but most of the people come to visit Akka, the harbor city with the massive and very impressive city walls and the beautiful old city. So before I take you on a virtual tour through Akka, I will first give you a quick overview of the history. And as I said, it goes back to the early Bronze Age, in which time it was a small settlement. There was no wall protecting the people who lived there. But then in the Middle Bronze Age, we're talking now about the 16th, 15th century before Christ, Akka becomes a fortified city, and it is quite a big city in that time period. It is mentioned in the Bible, especially in the period of the Iron Age, when, according to the biblical account, the Israelites came into the picture and they divided the land of Canaan between them, and one of the tribes of Asher, was supposed to get this territory and they had to conquer it. So Akka never became part of the territory of the tribe of Asher, and until today there are many biblical scholars who would debate whether Akka was part of the land of the Israelites. After the Iron Age, we move to the Hellenistic period, and in that period, just as in many other parts of the country, the people start moving down from the top of the Tel, down lower on the mount and even in the valley. And that is a common phenomena in the Hellenistic period. And now in the 3rd century before Christ, under the Ptolemaic rule, the Greeks start building a new city on the seashore, and then they give it the name Ptolemais after their ruler who ruled from Egypt. From that time period, from the Hellenistic period, there were some excavations done. One of the excavations showed houses from the Hellenistic period close to the seashore, but they have been covered again in order to preserve them, so you cannot see those. But there is one place where you can see excavations from the Hellenistic period, and that is inside the Knights' Hall, which is part of the Crusader period. So when they were excavating the Knights' Hall and they dug a little bit deeper, they found underneath it some dwellings dating back to the 3rd century before Christ. What we also know is that there was already an aqueduct in the Hellenistic period that would bring the water from a spring more to the north, and on the same location as that aqueduct, in later times, in the Ottoman time, they also built new aqueducts. So you can still see aqueducts, but they are not from the Hellenistic period. Actually, Ptolemais is mentioned in the book of Luke from the Bible, and there it tells us that Paul, who first was Saul of Tarsus, stopped in Ptolemais in the year 59 AD during his travels to bring the good news about Jesus the Messiah. From the Roman and Byzantine period, there are not really substantial archaeological remains. We know that the Umayyads later fortified the city, and we know that from written sources because they haven't found any of the walls of that time period, and would be talking about the 8th century AD. But the most important periods for Akka, and what we can still see today when we visit Akka, is from the Crusader period and the later Ottoman period. The Crusaders fortified the walls. They had fortifications inside the city walls. They did a lot of trade. They built a big cathedral, the St. John Cathedral. And during our virtual walk, you'll hear more about what the Crusaders did in Akka. Then the Mamluks came, and as you heard from me in the last podcast episode about Ascalon, the Mamluks had a policy of completely destroying all the coastal cities, because the Mamluks did not have a navy, and they were afraid that if the Crusaders would come back, that they would retake those fortified cities, and then the Mamluks would have a big problem. So instead of building up a navy, they decided to completely destroy all the coastal cities, including Akka. And they never built anything in Akka. after the Mamluk period, under the Ottomans, we start seeing a rebuilding and a renovation of the city. And there were two important figures that we have to mention. One of them is Jazzar al-Omar. We could hear about him in the interview I did with Bassam about the shaping of the identity of the Palestinians. He was a governor in the Galilee who was under the Ottoman rule. He collected taxes for the Ottoman rulers, but he became the first independent Arabic ruler over the Galilee. He was of Bedouin origin, and he managed to rule the Galilee almost independently. He made the trade in Akka bloom, especially the cotton trade, and he refortified the city. And when Napoleon came in the year 1799, Napoleon found the city walled by Jazzar al-Omar, and he looked from the from Tel el Fukhar, which is now often called Napoleon's Hill because there's a statue of Napoleon, and he looked from there to the city and he tried to breach the walls. He did manage to breach the wall at a certain point, but he didn't know that behind that wall there was another wall, and eventually Napoleon had to give up. He also struggled and suffered with a plague, and his soldiers were tired and he had to go back to Europe. So eventually Napoleon did not take Akka. And after Jazzar al-Omar was killed, there was a new ruler over Akka, and that was Ahmed al-Jazzar Pasha. And he ruled for the Ottomans in that region. And he was called al-Jazzar, which means the butcher, because he had a very tough reputation, we can say. But he said, let's build a completely new wall in order to prevent anything like this to ever happen again. And the walls that he built are the walls that we see today. They are sometimes 40 meters wide. They are incredibly thick walls on which at some points you have almost like a park situated on top of the wall. I've never seen such thick walls in any other city I've ever visited. So the walls that you see are not the walls that Napoleon tried to breach. These are the walls that were built after Napoleon's defeat in order to prevent anything like that to happen to Akka again. And of course we know that after the Ottoman period ended, Akka was, like the rest of the country, for a period under British rule, first under military, then civil, and later British mandate rule, until in 1948 the State of Israel was established. And today Akka is a city with a mixed population. Part of the population was forcibly displaced in 1948, and mainly in the old city center of Akka we will find Palestinians, families that have lived there for generations, and in the new modern Akka we will find Jewish Israeli population. And now I'll take you on a virtual tour. We will arrive to the city from the northern side. You have to imagine that the old city of Akka is basically on the northern tip of Akka Bay. And it is a little bit like a peninsula. So from the west, the south and the eastern side, there is water. So you come in from the northern entrance and you drive through a breach in the Ottoman wall dating from the time of Jazzar. You will have the wall, and then you will also see a deep moat, a dry moat that was part of the defense system. And this is also the area where you can park your vehicle if you are coming in by car or by bus. And the first thing we will do now is we will visit the Crusader Knights halls. We go into a beautiful garden called the Enchanted Garden, where there is the visitor center. And in the garden, you can see some spectacular 150-year-old ficus trees. In the visitor center, there is a model of the city of Akka, which is interesting to look at if you want to understand a little bit more where everything is. And then as you cross through the garden, you will get to the entrance of the Knights' Halls. This was, in the 13th century, the main quarter for the Hospitallers. The Hospitallers were an order, a knight's order, but they were mainly focused on taking care of the sick and wounded and tired pilgrims of the Crusades. The Hospitallers were originally called the Hospitallers of St. John of Jerusalem and are also known as the Order of Malta or the Knights of Malta. It's a religious military order that was founded during the Crusades in the 11th century, and they mainly had humanitarian tasks of taking care of the sick and wounded people during the Crusades, and until today they still take care of the needy people. But they were also knights, so they were a military order that cared mainly for the hospital work, let's say. And here they had a fortress and they had halls for the knights to stay, to eat, and a hospital and probably also a hospice for the pilgrims who were on their way to Jerusalem. Because for the Crusaders, Akka was not the final station. They weren't on their way just to the Holy Land, they were on their way to Jerusalem, because the main aim of the Crusades, especially in the beginning, was to liberate Jerusalem and especially the Church of the Holy Sepulchre from the Seljuk Turks, who were the new Muslim rulers and who were not very keen on the Christian presence in Jerusalem. And for sure there were other reasons why people went on pilgrimage, and there were different reasons for the knights and the nobility than for the common people, who were told by the Pope that if they went on the crusade, that they would be forgiven for all their sins and have direct access to heaven. But the matter of fact is that thousands and thousands of people left Europe and went on this long pilgrimage overland to the Holy Land. Many of them died on the way. Many of their animals, their horses also died on their way, because when they came more to the east, south, it was too hot and the land was too barren and they were not used to that. But those who arrived would first reach Akka, and that's where they could get some care and where they could strengthen before they would continue for the last probably 2-3 days walk until they would reach Jerusalem. Now, this place that you can visit, the Hospitaller Knights Hall, was rediscovered only about 80 years ago. What happened? Somewhere after the year 1679, and we know this because there is a drawing by a Dutchman called Cornelis de Bruin that shows a picture of the courtyard of the Knights Hall and some of the buildings around it that were in 1679 still visible and still fairly intact. And we can even see that there were 3 floors on that drawing. But somewhere after 1679, the whole Knights Hall, the fortress, was filled up with dirt and mud and debris by probably Zaher al-Omar in order to be able to build on top of it. Because Zaher al-Omar had 2 choices. Either he had to completely support the old Crusader buildings, the structures, the arched vaults, for it not to collapse, or, and that seems easier to do, he would completely fill it up so that it would become more sturdy, and then you could build on top of it. And what did they build on top of it? Part of the new city under the Ottomans. And especially on top of the Crusader fortress, they built the Saraya, which was the most important governmental building in the Ottoman period. And that later became the prison, and also the British used it as a prison. And today, when you visit, you can visit down the Crusader Hall that has been completely emptied and cleaned and excavated, and you can now walk through it and see how it looked like in the 12th, 13th century. But you can also go up and you can see the prison that is still mostly standing, from the time of the Ottomans and later in use by the British. And that's a museum that you can pay for. By the way, in that museum, the leader of the Baha'i, Baha'u'llah, I spoke about the Baha'i in an episode before, and the leader was imprisoned in this prison. He was later released. He was allowed to live somewhere in Akka in his own house, where he's also buried. And that is why Akka is the most important place for the Baha'i to visit, not the Baha'i gardens in Haifa, which is also very important and much more beautiful and special. But it is in Akka that Baha'u'llah is buried, and that is where his followers will visit him. Now back to the Crusader fortress. Excavated and completely cleaned about 80 years ago, it is now a museum that you can visit. You can get an audio guide and you can walk around and you can see how the Crusaders lived here in the 12th and 13th century. For example, you will see their refectory, their dining hall, which is a huge hall that has 3 extremely big pillars in the middle that were there in order to hold up the floors above it. So it was really a massive building. And this refectory opens onto a courtyard in which there was a water well. And just like in Ascalon, it was easy to get fresh water here because the fresh water will float on top of the salty seawater. So they could just lower the buckets and reach the freshwater level, the freshwater table, and have enough water inside their fortress. You can also see how the Crusaders used to go to the bathroom. They had latrines and they look a bit similar to the ones that we know from the Roman era. But the Romans, even though they lived in the Holy Land about 1,000 years before the Crusaders, they had an actual flushing system. The Crusaders didn't have that, and they would only be able to flush the latrines during times of rain, which is only part of the year. So you can imagine that it must have been a very, very smelly corner of the fortress. There's also a tunnel that was maybe part of the sewage system and maybe also part of an escape route. And then in the halls that you visit, you will also find some exhibitions of archaeological findings that they did. There is a very nice timeline giving you the history of Akka and the fortress. And you can learn a lot about the Crusader period itself because they have a lot of information signs that will give you all that background information. And the visit to the Crusader Knights Hall can be combined with a visit to the Ottoman bathhouse, the hammam, which is less than 10 minutes walk from the Crusader Knights Hall. But before I take you there, we will go out from the Enchanted Garden, as it's called, and we will first visit the Mosque of Ahmed al-Jazzar. It is the second biggest mosque in Palestine after the Aqsa Mosque. It was built in 1781 by Ahmed al-Jazzar. And it now has a big green dome, but it used to be a white dome, and that's why sometimes the mosque was also referred to as the White Mosque. Outside of the prayer times, you can visit the mosque, you can give a small donation to enter into the courtyard. Women have to wear very modestly. You are supposed to wear something also covering your hair, and men should wear something long. And then you will first see the ablution fountain where Muslims do wudu, which is the ritual cleaning before they go in to pray. And also next to the mosque is a mausoleum and a small graveyard with the tombs of Ahmed al-Jazzar Pasha and his adoptive son and successor Suleiman Pasha and their relatives. And you can see a sundial that was used before the invention of the watch and the clock, where people could read the time because of the shadow that the sun made using a stick and the numbers on the sundial. When you visit this mosque, you do not have to take off your shoes because they made a special area in the back of the mosque behind the balustrade where you can stand and you can watch and see the mosque from inside. In the corners there are green medallions with the names of the first 4 righteous caliphs, the Rashidun. And we can see the mihrab, which is facing always towards Mecca. In this case, that's to the south. And what this mosque has is a shrine, a relic shrine, in which it is said that there are some hairs of the beard of the Prophet Muhammad. And this is a tradition, of course, but every year in the month of Ramadan, on Laylatul Qadr, the 27th of the month of Ramadan, they have a special celebration where they bring out this relic. And otherwise it is on the gallery up on the women's prayer section. This is not the only mosque in Akka. There are several other mosques. There's another one with a blue dome that is not far from the Jazzar mosque. And that is a mosque, not really a mosque, actually a zawiyah of a Sufi order. It's called the Zawiyah Shadhuliyah. And the Shadhuliyah was one of the Sufi movements that originated in Tunisia. The sheikh who established it was called Ali Nuruddin al-Yasruti, and he is also known as al-Maghrabi. He came from Tunisia in 1868 because in a vision or in a dream, he had seen that Prophet Yunus, that's Prophet Jonah, told him to go to Akka and to spread his tariqah, which means that his way of understanding the Islam. So this Sufi order originates in Tunisia, and you can visit it if you organize and contact them in advance. Now let's go to the Turkish bathhouse. In this museum of the Turkish bathhouse, they have tried to make it a bit entertaining by putting all kinds of bronze statues in the shapes of humans, as if they are having a bath, as if they're having a scrub, going from warm to cold and from cold to warm, so that they will soften the skin and then they will get a good scrub to peel off the dead skin and the massage to relax. There are 2 videos that give you information on the history of the hammam. In my opinion, it was a bit of an Orientalist video where I felt that the Arabs were portrayed in a very stereotypical way. And what I got from this whole visit was that it is mainly for entertainment of families, although they did really make an effort to give you the history of this Turkish bath that was established under the same Ahmed al-Jazzar in the Ottoman period. Now, on our walk through the old city of Akka, we will pass by a number of khans. And a khan is an inn. It was established, especially in the Ottoman period, for travelers who would be passing by with their animals, maybe camels or horses or donkeys, carrying goods that they wanted to trade, and the people needed a rest. And Akka is on the crossing of several important routes. There is the Via Maris, the old Via Maris trade route. There is the Jizral Valley, the route between east and west. And of course, it is a harbor city. So a lot of people were coming from overseas. And in a khan, on the ground floor, they would be able to leave their animals that would be taken care of. They could store their products. And then on the first floor, there was like a hotel. There were rooms where the people could sleep. And there are several of these khans in the city. We have, for example, the Khan el Faranj. And Faranj was a word that was originally used for the French people. It was a khan that was built by French merchants. But later this word also became used in general for the foreigners, for people from outside. So we have Khan el Faranj. There is another very beautiful khan that unfortunately is not open to public at the moment. It's called Khan el Umdan. And it is called Khan el Umdan because in Arabic, Amud means pillar. And inside this khan, there are a huge number of columns or pillars that are beautiful and holding up the structure. These were originally from Caesarea and Athlete. These are Roman pillars, many of them granite that was imported, and these were brought all the way from this coastal city that was an archaeological site basically, to now support the structure of the Khan al-Umdan in Akka. And on top of this Khan, the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid placed one of his clock towers. I think I mentioned the clock towers before in a previous episode, definitely the one about Jaffa, because Abdul Hamid had his 25th anniversary, his silver jubilee, in the year 1906, and he built 100 clock towers all over his empire. 7 of these were built in Palestine. There's one, as I said, in Jaffa, in Haifa, in Akka, in Safat, in Nazareth, in Nablus, and there was also one in Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem it was on the Jaffa Gate. But that one was removed during the British Mandate period because according to the British, it didn't fit with the theme or the style of the old city walls. I bet you that their real reason to remove that clock tower was because they wanted to show the change of rule in the empire. But the picture of this clock tower in Akka was used at some point on stamps. It was printed on postal stamps and became an important symbol. Another tourist attraction in Akka is the tunnel that was excavated. It's about 150 meters tunnel that connected a Templar fortress in the west of Akka with the port, with the harbor. The Templar fortress, unfortunately, is completely gone. You can't see almost anything of that except for a little bit of foundation rocks that are now in the water. It's in the water level. And many people think that there was a harbor on the western side, but these rocks have nothing to do with the harbor. They were part of the Templar fortress. And it's not exactly clear what the tunnel's function was, whether it was an escape tunnel or was it to transport goods from the harbor to the Templar fortress without having to go through the crowded and narrow streets of Akka. This was one of the suggestions of our tour guide, who is also an archaeologist and specialist in the Crusader period. And he said that there was always water in the tunnel. There is a spring water that comes through this tunnel, which makes him think that maybe they used rafts inside the tunnel that could flow over a layer of water, and that would make it much easier and quicker to bring goods from the port to the Templar fortress. If you go through the tunnel now, you will also realize that you are walking on a wooden construction under which water is flowing. So this is one of the theories of the use of the Templar tunnel that was discovered not so long ago. And on the southwestern point of the, let's say, peninsula of the old city of Acre in the sea, there is the lighthouse, and there is a beautiful little church called the Church of St. John, which is a white church with a bell tower that has a nice little triangle-shaped red roof. It is very often photographed. There's not much to tell about this church. It was built by the Franciscans in 1743 in the Ottoman period over the remains of a previous church that was called the St. Andrew Church, the one who brought Christianity to Scotland, the one who was crucified on a horizontal cross. And it is a parish church for the local Christian Palestinian community. This is, by the way, the point where we are now, where you can see young men of Akka jumping from the walls of Akka into the sea below. And all the tourists who come will watch it with shock and awe, because you all realize that if they jump the wrong way, they may hit their heads on the rocks below, because you have to jump in the exactly right spot between the rocks. Otherwise, something terrible may happen, and it happens once in a while. But a lot of people have pictures and are waiting the moment when the guys will jump and you can have some fantastic pictures of guys flying in the air, jumping down into the Akko Bay. There are several good fish restaurants in this area. Abu Christo is one of them. In the harbor, you can also get on a boat. There is the bigger boats that take a bit longer. And you have also this kind of speedy boats. They are a bit smaller, more for families. And you can have a view of Akka from the sea this way. When you get into the Akka Bay, you will see a small island a bit off the shore. It is called the Tower of the Flies. In Arabic, it's called Al-Manara. And there are some remains of old Persian and Hellenistic time walls. Most of them have crumbled down. It is not known why it's called the Island of the Flies, but there is a theory, because in Hebrew it's called Migdal Hatzvufim, which means the Island of the Flies. And in the Crusader period, when the Crusaders called it Acre instead of Akko or Akka, Acre sounds a little bit like Akron. And they identified, or they misidentified it with Akron. Akron was a Philistine city in the south near Ashdod. And one of the gods of the Philistines was called, in Hebrew, Baal Zvuv, which means the Lord of the Flies. So maybe because of the misinterpretation of Acre being Akron, being a Philistine city, with their god Baal Zvuv, the Lord of the Flies, that they called this island Lord of the Flies. And before we go back to the bus or to the car, let's walk up the ramp to stand on top of the city wall, the wall that was built by Ahmed al-Jazzar Pasha, 20 to 40 meters thick at certain points. And he built a ramp so that he could get the cannons up. And you can still see now the cannons on the top pointed outwards in order to defend the city. From this point, you can see there is also a museum in the corner at the Burj el Commandeur, which means the Tower of the Commander. This is a museum that focuses on the history of the Galilee. And from here you can also still see part of the aqueduct that came in from the north and that brought water to the city. And because it comes from up and then it goes down and then again up, it's what we call the inverted siphon that was invented by the Romans. The water will actually always seek its original level, so it can go through a valley and then up again. And then it comes into a sort of a reservoir tank that is now in the middle of a roundabout. And from there it was diverted everywhere into the city. And next to this roundabout, there used to be a khan, an inn, remember, called Khan el Hamir, which means the Khan of the donkeys. That was the location where the Ottomans had stored all their ammunition. And in 1840, the British came because they wanted to get rid of Muhammad Ali, who ruled Palestine between 1831 and 1840. And the British didn't want the Ottoman Empire to last. The European powers wanted the Ottoman Empire to fall and crumble so that they could take over the region, which is what happened eventually. But in that time, there was a governor, an Ottoman governor from Egypt, Muhammad Ali, who took over control of Palestine, and he was even planning to go up all the way to Istanbul, and the British wanted to stop that. So the British Navy was in the Bay of Akka, and then they shot and they hit the ammunition that was stored in the Khan el Hamir. And the whole building exploded with a huge boom. And since then, it was completely in ruins, later cleared, and it was an empty space. And only recently did the municipality decide to start building there again. And now it has been renovated, and it is a new big white building that includes a hostel where you can stay overnight. And it is a very good idea to go to Akka and to stay There are several Palestinian families who run guest houses in the old city. You do not have to go to the municipality guest house. There are many restaurants where you can eat delicious fish and other typical Palestinian food. There is a vibrant market where you can buy all sorts of things. And if you don't want to walk, you can go around with some of the guys who have a little cart, beautifully decorated, pulled by a horse. And so you can see part of the city without even having to walk. Of course, there is much more to say and to tell, but this was a brief history on Akka and a short virtual tour. And I hope that I tempted you to go and see it by yourself. And that's the end of this week's episode. Thank you for listening. You know, producing this podcast takes a lot of time, and there are also costs for hosting the podcast, for the website, and some of the subscriptions related to online recording and editing. So if you enjoy listening to Stories from Palestine, which is available completely for free, then you can do a donation on the Ko-fi platform, and that is really very helpful. Even if it's just a little contribution. Because if all listeners do that once in a while, then I can continue producing new episodes. It's very easy, just click the link in the show notes right after this message. And I hope you will listen again to the next episode.